Hello and welcome back to the One Piece Deep Dive. It's been a little longer than I had initially hoped at the end of the first episode, but sometimes life just decks you like a train. Speaking of getting decked, after decking Helmeppo, Luffy heads to free Zoro, ignoring Helmeppo's threats to tell his father on him. We cut to Morgan himself inside the Marine base, whose literal first line is shouting, "I'm so great!" And suddenly it makes a lot of sense of how Helmeppo ended up the way he is. Morgan speaks to a Marine in his office regarding the civilians being lacking in the payments they must give, that he calls tribute. And I think it's very interesting how this early in the story, the concept of civilians having to pay some kind of tribute to the people in charge, and the Marines abusing that power, is something introduced this early on into the story. But this brilliant bit of setup is interrupted by Helmeppo barging into the room, demanding Morgan kill someone for him. We cut to that person Helmeppo wants to kill, talking to the person Helmeppo is currently killing. Zoro is still adamant on not becoming a pirate, despite Luffy's insistence. But once the topic of Zoro's swords is brought up, Luffy decides that he will get his swords back in exchange for him joining his crew. Zoro doesn't even get a chance to agree before Luffy just starts running off towards the Marine base, where the Marines in the base are all busy on the roof, raising a statue in Morgan's image, while the mighty Morgan himself relaxes on a couch. Helmeppo shouts at his father for not immediately going after Luffy, to which Morgan hits him clean in the face, and we get our first look at Morgan's design. A massive imposing figure with a literal axe for his right hand, and what appears to be some reinforced jaw smoking a cigar. As we get his full appearance, we also get to see the true depths of his character, as once he discovers Helmeppo let Rika go for trespassing on the execution grounds, he demands another officer go and kill her. When the lieutenant refuses to murder a small child, Morgan attacks him on grounds of treachery. And here we see how deeply he has control over his subordinates, with how they immediately fall in line despite their clear concern for the lieutenant. Right as he's about to attack another Marine for bumping into the statue, Luffy jumps in, using the first Gum Gum rocket we see in the series. Overshooting, but luckily he manages to grab onto the ropes holding Morgan's statue, causing the whole thing to break and collapse. Morgan goes into a rage, demanding Luffy's head as the Marines go to rush him, but Luffy just kidnaps Helmeppo and starts running into the base. As all this goes on, Koby decides to finally take his stance. He can't stand that Zoro was imprisoned unfairly, and believes in Luffy's cause. He goes into the field to untie Zoro, only to get shot by Morgan's men. Luffy drags Helmeppo throughout the base, only to discover that they passed his personal room where he was keeping Zoro's swords in. The Marines catch up, aiming their guns straight at Luffy, who just responds by using Helmeppo as a human shield and charging forward. As Luffy gets into the room, he is confused to discover 3 swords, and Helmeppo is too unconscious to say anything. But as Luffy looks outside, he sees that the Marines have surrounded Zoro, ready to execute him. Right as the gunmen take aim, we zoom into Zoro's thoughts, and fade into a flashback about a promise he alludes to. We see a young Zoro on the ground after losing a sparring match with a girl Kuina. The other boys in the dojo are in disbelief, accusing the sensei of having taught her some secret tricks because she's his daughter, something he denies. Zoro also doesn't take losing too well. And later that night, Zoro challenges Kuina to a rematch, this time with real swords. And he still loses. But it's only when they start talking after the fight where Kuina opens up about her insecurities, being a swordsman who is a girl. She states that when she and Zoro grow up, Zoro will be naturally stronger than her, and she'll never be able to achieve her dream. This idea also seems to be pushed on by her own father, dismissing the idea of a woman being the strongest swordsman, and this clearly tears her apart. But Zoro refuses to give in to that idea. He sees her skill and he strives to beat her, and when he does, it won't be because she's a girl. The two make a promise one day to be the world's strongest swordsman and fight each other for that title. But in the very next page, we find out with Zoro that Kuina has died, fallen down a flight of stairs. Soon after, she is laid to rest. Zoro requests to have Kuina's blade, to which the sensei agrees. Zoro swears over it in tears to continue their promise to become the world's greatest swordsman. Kuina's death is sudden, and I do think that's part of the point. Not just because it's a short flashback in an already pretty short story arc, but also that each of the main characters have one form of tragedy to them or another. One that often connects to their dreams and motivations for journeying throughout the series. And this event gives Zoro a very close relation to death and mortality. Both Zoro and Luffy go through their journey to fulfill a promise, and both in a sense physically carry their wills, with the Straw Hat and Kuina's sword. But while Shanks is a pillar to achieve for Luffy, Kuina is Zoro's reminder to push on. And before anyone asks, no, there is no source that I have found that falling down the stairs is a metaphor for taking one's own life in Japan. That's a stupid urban legend made up by One Piece fans to try to needlessly add tragedy to an already tragic backstory. Kuina's tragedy is that she is someone of clear skill and talent, but is questioned by other students and looked down by her father because of her gender. And when her skill is finally validated by someone, it is abruptly cut short before she could prove her father wrong. My only real issue with the backstory is that we don't actually see any interaction between Kuina and her father. Not even a small panel showing his disapproval, but all the needed emotion is still there to make the scene effective. We fade out from the flashback, just as Morgan orders the Marines to open fire, but Luffy rockets through the window, landing just in time to catch the bullets with his body, which thankfully isn't lethal to him, or even seem to bother him at all as he launches the bullets right back at the crowd. Koby's already passed out as Zoro asks what Luffy is, and Luffy responds that he is the man who will become king of the pirates. Luffy offers all three swords to Zoro, which is when we discover that all three swords actually belong to him. And we see just how Zoro uses all three swords once he's untied, holding off all of the Marines with one sword in each hand and the third in his mouth, intimidating the Marines enough for Zoro to have a full conversation where he tells Luffy his dream of becoming the world's greatest swordsman, and makes him affirm that dream before letting Luffy take out the whole crowd with a gum-gum whip. The Marines begin to break morale, to which Morgan orders those complaining to shoot themselves in the head. And we see the Marines raise their guns to their heads as Luffy charges to stop the order, starting the first fight in the series that's longer than just one punch. And while Morgan's strength is nothing to sneeze at, Luffy outmaneuvers him, beating him to the ground, only to be stopped by Helmeppo holding a gun to Koby's head. And it is here where we see the full effect Luffy has had on Koby, as he no longer has that fear of death that kept him from standing up to Alvida, calling Luffy to not hesitate for his sake. Morgan attempts to take a sneak attack while Luffy's looking away, only for both Morgan and Helmeppo to be taken out at the same time, as Zoro slashes down Morgan while Luffy punches out Helmeppo. There is a moment of silence between our protagonist and the Marines, before the Marines erupt in cheers at the defeat of Morgan. And so everyone begins to celebrate. Oh yeah, Zoro hasn't eaten in 9 days. And so Luffy, Zoro, and Koby have a celebratory meal at Rika's home, and plan to part ways. Luffy and Zoro are set to ignore Koby's warnings and head straight for the Grand Line, while Koby himself still plans on enlisting into the Marines. Zoro, however, warns Koby that the Marines won't let him join if they find out that he worked on Alvida's ship. And just then, a squadron of Marines appear at the front door. They're grateful for Luffy and Zoro for taking out Morgan, but since pirates are considered criminals, they can't shelter them. So they compromise, politely asking them to leave, and no word of them will reach Marine headquarters. And Luffy does just as asked, making no fuss despite even the townsfolk's frustration, only stopping when the Marine begins to question if Koby is with them. Koby denies it, but the question is then asked to Luffy. And just as it looks like Luffy's about to thoughtlessly reveal Koby's connection, Koby decks him in the face. Luffy retaliates, making a clear show to the officer that Koby is not associated with him. Afterwards, Koby asks the officer if he can join the Marines, saying he's willing to do anything just to join. When one of the other officers begins to question if Koby could be a spy for pirates, Koby loudly and very Luffy-like affirms his desire to be a Marine. And that's enough to convince the Marines to allow him in. Luffy and Zoro begin setting up to sail out, but Koby stops them one last time to say a proper goodbye and thanks, which is super sweet, but also, Koby, you just got the crap beaten out of you to prove you weren't associated with these guys. Why are you... Oh, never mind. As the Marines see Luffy off with a salute, and Koby probably wondering if the beating he took was really necessary, Luffy and Zoro sail off, with Luffy setting sights for the Grand Line. For a first story arc, Romance Dawn does a lot of heavy lifting in having to introduce the world to the audience. The first chapter was laser focused on Luffy and his backstory. The following chapters have to introduce the Marines, their issues with corruption, other more villainous pirates, the Grand Line, while also introducing both one of the main characters and their backstory, alongside one of the series' most important reoccurring characters. For Zoro, his introduction does well in introducing both his selflessness and gullibility, both with his protection of Rika as well as eating her ruined rice balls, but also how he genuinely believes Helmeppo will keep his word, even though this is the kind of place that firmly believes in guilt by association. I already mentioned how Zoro's backstory and promise is a more tragic reflection on Luffy's, but the comparisons don't end there. While on the outside, Zoro and Luffy seem very different, Luffy being much more happy-go-lucky, and Zoro having a more serious face in most situations, the two become very similar the more we see them interact. Both are willing to put themselves at risk, are willing to defend others, and both are as dumb as rocks in most non-combat situations. Oddly, despite being a very combat-heavy character, Zoro doesn't do much fighting in this arc, on account of starving. He holds off the Marines for his conversation, and finishes off Morgan, but in terms of actions, that's about it. Not that I mind too much, as it gives us a good chance to spotlight Luffy's own combat skill, while allowing Zoro's introduction to be focused more on showing his morals and motivation before any large feats of strength. Meanwhile, Koby has a whole character arc throughout these opening chapters, starting as a meek chore boy too scared to leave his captors even after building a boat, though maybe that was self-preservation kicking in given how poorly the boat was made, to someone willing to sacrifice themselves if it means making sure the Marines were stopped. This all culminates when Koby is forced to stand up to Luffy to prove himself to the Marines. And while Koby may lament on having to rely on Luffy's help once more, I would say it was a necessary step for Koby's growth. He had been picked on by Alvida and her crew for years, and now that he was finally free, there was only one person left that he had to stand up to. Now that that hurdle's been crossed, Koby can go on to achieve his dreams without being controlled by fear. Captain Morgan and Helmeppo make a great duo in introducing the forms of corruption that have infested the Marines. Morgan's extremist views on criminality and tendency to jump to violence, even on his own comrades, is something we'll see again in a number of Marines. Though I can definitely think of one particular Marine admiral when reading Morgan's ideology on treating criminals. Helmeppo, meanwhile, abuses the power that comes with his family, something that we would see used by world nobles throughout the story. However, soon after Morgan's introduction, Helmeppo's own threat level begins to drastically drop. He's a petty asshole, but the moment Morgan takes control of the officers and Luffy has begun his shenanigans, his whole facade of power breaks apart. He would eventually go on to become an example of how a person can change when given the opportunity to be better. The Marines are also introduced well in this arc. We start with Koby aspiring to join them, but by the time we actually see them, they're beaten dogs for a petty tyrant, with anyone who speaks out getting severely punished. They're controlled by fear, no different from the pirates on Alvida's ship, and when we finally see the lengths to which Morgan has control over these people, it's Koby that shouts to Luffy to take down these terrible Marines. It's only once the rotten leadership is dealt with and the Marines are freed where they show the basic kindness and decency that was lacking under Morgan. It's a good reminder that while yes, they enforce a corrupt institution that needs to be taken down, many of them are still people. People with beliefs probably not too different from how Koby started out. People who can be intimidated by their superiors or fooled by propaganda and deserve a second chance not under a violent egomaniacal leader. Rika is the first in a long line of child characters who our protagonists meet to form an emotional connection to the plot. She's well characterized, with her sneaking onto the field to feed Zoro, plus her rice balls being made with sugar instead of salt because obviously as a kid she'd prefer sweeter foods. And it does all come around nicely with her feeding all the other protagonists after Morgan is defeated. But outside of that, she's quickly shooed off almost immediately after making her emotional connection, and it's only at the very end where we finally see her again. She works well as an emotional anchor for the plot, but other than that, she's pretty generic. Finally, this is the first time we get to see Luffy acting on the same principles that Shanks had shown in the first chapter. Though instead of the cool-headed confidence Shanks has, Luffy is much more slapstick-esque, with the antagonists being these pins for Luffy to cathartically take down. Standing up for Koby, punching Helmeppo in the face, freeing Zoro, Luffy plays around and doesn't take things too seriously until things are truly dire. But he's not just doing this for his own enjoyment. He's taking these people out for Koby's sake and to save Zoro. And his final favor to Koby is pushing for him to stand up for himself. Something we see Luffy do with others throughout the whole story. I'd argue it's one of his biggest defining character traits. It's why the crew Luffy gets have such loyalty and belief in him, because Luffy thoroughly believes in his crew back. Just look at that proud smile Luffy has for Koby in that scene. And that is the first story arc of One Piece. I hope you all enjoyed this deep dive into the first few chapters of One Piece. And I hope to see you in the next video, where we start to analyze the Orange Town arc. I would make some kind of optimistic remark about it coming out soon, but I'm worried if I do that an actual train might hit me.